In 1943, a British admiral walked into a top-secret meeting with the most powerful military commanders in the world. Churchill, Roosevelt's generals, the entire Allied High Command, pulled out a pistol and shot it at a block of ice. The bullet ricocheted off, buzzed across the room, and grazed the leg of the chief of US naval operations. Security personnel burst through the doors, convinced someone had started shooting the generals. The admiral smiled. He had just proven that this block of ice was stronger than steel, and he was there to tell them that Britain intended to build an aircraft carrier, the largest warship in the history of warfare, out of it. This is the true story of Project Habakkuk, the most insane military technology ever approved at the highest levels of Allied command. A weapon so bizarre that even Winston Churchill initially thought it was a joke. A ship made of ice that almost changed the outcome of World War II. In 1942, Britain was being starved to death. Not slowly, fast. German U-boats were sinking Allied supply ships at a rate that made survival arithmetic terrifying. Every week, hundreds of thousands of tons of food, fuel, and ammunition, everything Britain needed to stay in the war, was going to the bottom of the Atlantic. There was a specific stretch of ocean that was worse than anywhere else. The Allies called it the Mid-Atlantic Gap, the Black Pit. It sat roughly in the middle of the ocean, too far from Britain for aircraft flying east, too far from America for aircraft flying west. No Allied plane could reach it, and the German U-boats knew exactly where it was. In the Black Pit, the U-boats owned the ocean. They hunted in wolf packs, groups of submarines coordinating attacks across hundreds of miles. A convoy would enter the gap with dozens of ships. What came out the other side was something less, sometimes much less. The solution was obvious: put aircraft over the Black Pit. Aircraft could spot U-boats, call in warships, and force the submarines to dive, which made them slow and limited their range. An airplane over the gap could save an entire convoy, but aircraft need somewhere to land, and in the middle of the Atlantic, there was nowhere. They needed a floating airfield. They needed it fast. They needed it cheap, because steel and aluminum were already being consumed by the war at a rate that left almost nothing spare. And they needed it to survive torpedo attacks, because whatever they put out there, the U-boats would immediately try to sink it. What they needed was something almost literally unsinkable, something abundant, something free. Someone looked at the North Atlantic, covered in ice, and had the most insane idea of the entire war. Geoffrey Pyke once sent his commanding officer a classified telegram that read, in its entirety, "Chief of Naval Construction is an old woman, signed Pyke." He was not fired. He was too valuable to fire. Which tells you everything you need to know about Geoffrey Pyke. He was not a military man. He was not an engineer. He was not the kind of person you would normally find in a top-secret British War Department advising Lord Mountbatten on naval strategy. He was a journalist who had once snuck into wartime Germany under a false passport at the age of 20, been captured, escaped from a German prison by pretending to be a Swedish businessman, walked to the Dutch border alone, and written a best-selling book about it before anyone thought to stop him. The London Times, at his death, called him one of the most original, if unrecognized, figures of the present century. Lord Mountbatten called him the most unusual and provocative man I have ever met. His own government's intelligence services investigated him as a suspected Soviet spy. He was probably not a Soviet spy. He was something harder to categorize. A man whose mind operated on a frequency nobody else could quite tune into. In September 1942, Pyke sent Mountbatten a memorandum. Not a short memo, 232 pages. A document proposing not just one idea, but an entire philosophy of warfare built around the strategic use of ice. Floating platforms, ice fortifications, weapons that used supercooled water as ammunition. And at the center of it all, the flagship proposal, a fleet of aircraft carriers built not from steel, but from ice. Mountbatten read the first 30 pages and called it gold. He took it to Churchill, and here is where the story gets strange, because Churchill, a man who had seen every kind of desperate, impossible, half-mad wartime proposal, did not laugh. He approved it, but there was a problem. Plain ice is brittle. A torpedo hitting a block of ice does not bounce off. It shatters it. Bombs do not dent ice, they explode it. And an aircraft carrier made of regular ice, sitting in the Atlantic, would melt by spring. What Pyke needed was ice that wasn't ice anymore. What he needed was a material that had never existed before. And in a basement laboratory beneath a London meatpacking company, two scientists were about to accidentally invent it. The material they created was 86% ice and 14% wood pulp, essentially sawdust mixed into water and frozen. That does not sound impressive. What it could do was extraordinary. You could fire a bullet into it and the bullet bounced off. You could hit it with an axe and the axe bounced back. You could drop it in boiling water and it took hours to melt. It was, by any measure, one of the most remarkable engineering materials ever accidentally discovered. They named it Pykrete, Pyke's concrete. The science behind it was elegant. When wood fibers are suspended in ice, they create a network of reinforcement. The same principle that makes reinforced concrete stronger than plain concrete. The wood pulp also acts as insulation, forming a wet, fibrous crust on the surface when it begins to melt, which then protects the interior from further melting. A block of Pykrete left in warm water does not melt evenly. It forms its own armor. Mountbatten was so excited he reportedly barged into Churchill's bathroom while the Prime Minister was bathing, carrying a block of Pykrete. He dropped it in the tub. Churchill watched it float for what seemed like an impossible amount of time in the hot water, barely diminishing. He was, by all accounts, immediately convinced. Then came the Quebec Conference of 1943, the moment of the gunshot. Churchill and Roosevelt's entire Allied command were gathered to plan the final strategy for winning the war. Mountbatten had one item he wanted to add to the agenda: an aircraft carrier made of ice. He brought two blocks into the room, one regular ice, one Pykrete. He invited General Hap Arnold, deemed the strongest man present, to cut through both with an ice axe. Arnold swung once at the regular ice. It split cleanly. He swung at the Pykrete. The axe bounced. He swung again and again. The Pykrete held. The room was already impressed when Mountbatten drew his service revolver. He fired at the regular ice. It shattered. He fired at the Pykrete. The bullet ricocheted, buzzed across the room like an angry hornet, and grazed the leg of Admiral Ernest King, Chief of U.S. Naval Operations. Security burst through the door. Someone outside apparently thought a general had been shot. Mountbatten had not planned for the ricochet, but the effect was perfect. The room understood, viscerally and immediately, what Pykrete was. This was not ice. This was something that bullets could not penetrate. Something that axes could not split. Something that, in theory, torpedoes could not sink. Project Habakkuk was approved at the highest level. Construction of a prototype would begin immediately in Canada, in secret, in the wilderness, in the cold. Consider this. The Titanic was 882 feet long and weighed 52,000 tons. The proposed Habakkuk aircraft carrier would be 2,000 feet long, more than twice the length of the Titanic, and weigh 2.2 million tons, 26 times the displacement of the Queen Elizabeth. It would carry 150 aircraft, house thousands of sailors, and move through the water powered by 20 electric motors. A floating city made of frozen sawdust. Its walls would be 30 feet thick enough that a torpedo impacting the hull would detonate inside the Pykrete and be absorbed rather than penetrating to the interior. Its sheer mass meant that waves of 50 feet, the worst the Atlantic could throw, would barely move it. And if surface damage did occur, the repair process was simple. Mix more Pykrete solution, pour it into the damaged area, and let it freeze. The ship could heal itself. To prove the concept before committing to full construction, the Allies needed a prototype. They chose Patricia Lake in the Jasper National Park of Alberta, Canada. Remote, cold, secret, and conveniently close to a camp of conscientious objectors who could serve as labor. 15 men worked through the Canadian winter of 1943. They built a vessel 60 feet long, 30 feet wide, weighing 1,000 tons. They covered it with a roof and camouflaged it to look like a boathouse. The prototype floated. It held together. It performed as the theory predicted. Standing on Patricia Lake in the winter of 1943, looking at this structure of frozen wood pulp bobbing in the freezing water, the engineers could genuinely see a path to the full-size vessel. Pyke's madness was starting to look less like madness. But the problems were multiplying faster than the solutions. The full-size ship would require a refrigeration system so large and complex that it would need 4 power stations just to run it. The steel required for that refrigeration plant alone was greater than the steel needed to build an entire conventional aircraft carrier. It would need 300,000 tons of wood pulp, 25,000 tons of fiberboard, 35,000 tons of timber. It would need 8,000 men working in Arctic temperatures for 8 months to assemble the Pykrete blocks. And when it was finished, it would move at 7 knots, barely faster than a rowing boat. Geoffrey Pyke watched the problems mount with the fury of a man watching his life's masterpiece being dismantled piece by piece. He fired off increasingly hostile telegrams. He confronted admirals in corridors. He accused committees of cowardice and incompetence. And slowly, inevitably, the men with the calculators began to win the argument over the man with the vision. Geoffrey Pyke was removed from his own project. The man who conceived it, sold it to Churchill, named it, built the material it depended on, and spent 2 years fighting for it, was quietly pushed aside. Mountbatten decided Pyke had become a liability. Too abrasive, too difficult, too willing to send classified insults to senior naval officers. He was excluded from meetings. His access was revoked. Project Habakkuk continued without its creator. In December 1943, the final Habakkuk board meeting took place. The conclusion was clinical and brief. The large Habakkuk aircraft carrier, made of Pykrete, had been found to be impractical because of the enormous production resources required and the technical difficulties involved. The project was cancelled. The reasons were real and reasonable. Portugal had allowed Britain to use airfields in the Azores, which suddenly gave Allied aircraft reach over the Black Pit. Long-range fuel tanks were extending patrol time. Escort carriers, small, cheap, conventional steel ships, were being produced fast enough to close the gap. The problem Habakkuk was designed to solve was being solved by other, simpler means. The ice carrier was no longer needed. The prototype at Patricia Lake was left where it was. Nobody dismantled it. Nobody moved it. They just stopped maintaining the refrigeration system and let the Canadian summer do the rest. But Pykrete, true to its nature, did not go easily. It took 3 consecutive hot Canadian summers, 3 full years, before the prototype completely melted. Even abandoned, it refused to die quickly. The metal components sank to the bottom of Patricia Lake, where they remain today, 50 feet below the surface, marked by an underwater plaque. Divers who have visited the site report finding the wooden hull walls still partly intact, tangled cold air ductwork, and pools of the bitumen insulation, ghostly and preserved in the cold, dark water. The remains of an aircraft carrier that never sailed, in a lake in the Canadian Rockies, 2,000 miles from the ocean it was built to patrol. Geoffrey Pyke never recovered. Stripped of his project, stripped of recognition, His most productive period behind him, he spent the final years of his life in increasing isolation and depression. In 1948, at the age of 54, he died alone. He was found by his housekeeper. The coroner's verdict was suicide. Project Habakkuk is remembered, when it is remembered at all, as a curiosity, the war's great eccentric footnote, a mad idea that almost worked. But that framing misses what it actually was. In 1942, Britain's survival was genuinely at risk. The Atlantic was being lost, and the response of the British war machine, stripped of resources, running on ingenuity and desperation, was to ask whether the ocean's own ice could be turned into a weapon. Not as a joke, not as an experiment in a laboratory, as a serious, fully funded, highest priority military program approved by the Prime Minister himself. Pykrete, ice stronger than concrete, named for a man history largely forgot, was a genuine materials breakthrough. The engineering principles Pyke's team developed, the understanding of composite ice behavior, the application of wood fiber reinforcement, these were not nonsense. They were decades ahead of their time. The prototype, built by 15 men in the Canadian wilderness, kept frozen by a 1-horsepower motor, floated for 3 summers after it was abandoned. It did not want to stop. At the bottom of Patricia Lake right now, 50 feet below the surface, in the cold, dark water of the Canadian Rockies, the metal bones of that prototype are still there. A plaque on the lakebed reads, Project Habakkuk, 1943, prototype of an aircraft carrier made from Pykrete. You can dive to it, you can touch it. Geoffrey Pyke chose the project's name from the book of Habakkuk in the Old Testament. One verse in particular, I will work a work in your days, which ye will not believe, though it be told you. He was right about that. Even now, told plainly and factually, it is almost impossible to believe. A 2.2 million-ton aircraft carrier made of ice and sawdust, approved by Churchill and Roosevelt's generals, actually built and tested, sitting at the bottom of a lake in Alberta. War makes the impossible necessary, and sometimes, just sometimes, the impossible almost works.